You just killed an animal 10 times bigger than you can eat in a day. There's no refrigerator, no freezer, no plastic wrap, just meat, warm air, and flies already circling. Within hours, bacteria will start breaking it down. Within a day or two, in the wrong climate, it could be completely inedible. And yet your ancestors regularly killed large animals, harvested more grain than they could eat in a week, and still made that food last for months. Today, you throw out food that's a single day past its expiration date. Your ancestors had none of the technology that makes that expiration date possible, and they still had to make surplus food outlast the season. So how did they actually pull that off? Let's start high in the Andes Mountains, thousands of years before refrigeration existed anywhere on Earth. Archaeologist Christine Hastorf has spent years studying how early Andean societies solved this exact problem, using something the environment gave them for free: extreme cold and thin, dry air. Potatoes harvested at high altitude were spread out overnight, where temperatures dropped well below freezing. By morning, the potatoes were frozen solid. Then people trampled them underfoot, squeezing out the water as the ice inside began to thaw in the daytime sun. Repeat that freeze-thaw cycle for several days, and something remarkable happens. The potato transforms into a lightweight, dry, almost indestructible product called chuño. It can last for years, not weeks. Years. That's not a lucky accident. That's food science executed by people who had no thermometers, no scientific vocabulary for what dehydration or oxidation even meant, using nothing but the mountain's own climate as a machine. Different environment, same underlying problem, gave rise to a completely different solution. Far to the north, in the brutal cold of Arctic Siberia, archaeologist Vladimir Pitulko has excavated sites where ancient hunters processed woolly mammoths and other large Ice Age animals. The evidence suggests that meat wasn't just eaten immediately. Some of it was deliberately placed into naturally cold ground, effectively an early form of cold storage, using permafrost the same way you use a freezer. Think about what that means. Long before anyone invented refrigeration as a concept, your ancestors had already identified frozen ground as a tool. Nature had built the freezer. They just had to know where to dig. Not every ancestor lived somewhere cold enough for that trick to work, though. So people also turned to something that sounds almost like the opposite of preservation: deliberately letting food rot in a very specific, controlled way. That's fermentation, and it's older and stranger than most people assume. Biomolecular archaeologist Patrick McGovern has spent decades analyzing residue left inside ancient pottery, chemical traces absorbed into the clay itself, to reconstruct what people were actually fermenting thousands of years ago. His research has uncovered evidence of fermented beverages and food stretching back further than most written history, often centered around one core discovery: certain microorganisms, when allowed to grow under the right conditions, don't just make food last longer. They actively prevent the harmful bacteria that cause true spoilage from taking hold. In other words, your ancestors weren't simply tolerating decay. They were directing it, encouraging one type of microscopic life to outcompete another, without understanding germs, without a microscope, purely through trial, error, and generations of careful observation. If you're starting to realize just how much invisible engineering went into something as basic as not starving, hitting subscribe means you won't miss the next one. Now back to the food. Grain created its own unique challenge. Unlike meat, it doesn't rot in hours, but it does something almost as dangerous over time. It attracts moisture, pests, and mold if left exposed. Archaeologist George Wilcox has studied some of the earliest known grain storage systems in the Fertile Crescent, sites where people dug deep, carefully sealed pits into the ground specifically to store surplus seed and food. These weren't crude holes. The pits were often lined and sealed in ways that limited oxygen and moisture from reaching the grain inside. Less oxygen meant fewer organisms could survive to spoil it. Your ancestors had essentially invented a low-tech vacuum seal thousands of years before the concept had a name, buried a few feet beneath their own settlements. There's an added layer of cleverness here too. Some of these storage pits were built close enough to living areas that people could monitor them constantly, checking for the telltale smell or texture that signaled spoilage had begun. If a pit started to fail, they knew almost immediately, not months later, when it was too late to save anything else. The storage system wasn't just a container. It was an early warning system, built into the architecture of daily life. Meat presented its own separate puzzle in warmer climates where frozen ground wasn't an option. In these regions, people relied heavily on drying and smoking, stripping meat into thin strips and hanging it over a low fire or in direct sun until most of the moisture was gone. Without that moisture, the bacteria responsible for decay simply couldn't get a foothold. It's the same basic principle behind the chuño, made in the Andes. Dry enough that spoilage runs out of fuel, just achieved with heat and airflow instead of freezing cold. Picture the full scene now. In the mountains, someone tramples a frozen potato underfoot at dawn. In the Arctic, someone lowers a haunch of mammoth meat into frozen ground and marks the spot. In a village near the Euphrates, someone seals a storage pit shut, pressing dirt over the top by hand, while nearby, someone else tends a low fire hung thick with drying strips of meat. None of these people ever met. None of them had writing, chemistry, or refrigeration. And yet independently, using only the materials in front of them, they all solved a version of the exact same problem. Here's the twist that ties it together. Almost none of these methods actually required inventing new technology. Your ancestors didn't build machines to preserve food. They noticed what the environment was already doing: cold ground freezing meat, dry mountain air pulling moisture from potatoes, wild microbes competing with harmful bacteria, and then deliberately steered those natural processes toward a purpose. That distinction matters because it means food preservation wasn't really invented once. It was independently discovered over and over by different groups paying close attention to the world around them. And you're still living inside their discoveries right now, whether you notice it or not. That yogurt in your fridge relies on the exact same fermentation principle McGovern traces back thousands of years. Freeze-dried camping meals use a modern industrial version of the same freeze-thaw cycle behind chuño. Even a simple root cellar dug into a backyard is a direct descendant of those sealed grain pits in the Fertile Crescent. You just have a compressor doing the cold part now instead of a mountain. The next time you open your fridge without thinking twice about it, you're relying on a set of solutions your ancestors spent thousands of years discovering by hand, tested against the one consequence that mattered more than any other. If it didn't work, people went hungry. It worked. And somehow, without a single lab or thermometer, they figured out exactly how to make food outlast the season that grew it. If stories like this change the way you look at your own kitchen, there's a lot more prehistory to explore, so make sure you're subscribed for the next one.